Welcome to a very special edition of Dateline News and Conversation. Um, my guests tonight are five friends. I've had them on the show before, all by themselves, but the topic tonight is really the title and the theme of a book that they've recently had published. It's called Killing Democracy: Western Imperialism's Legacy of Regime Change and Media Manipulation. My goodness, if this isn't an appropriate and timely topic, given what just happened yesterday with Trump finally bombing and invading Venezuela and kidnapping the president of Venezuela. This is just an incredibly brazen and outrageous example of democracy, the Constitution, and international law being destroyed by what Trump, who's the face of the empire, did yesterday. Now, tonight, there isn't a better group of people to discuss this than my guests tonight, because in their book, Killing Democracy, they provide, in my opinion, what is so important is the historical context for what the United States, the empire, the hegemon, has been doing, well, for more than 100 years, maybe a couple hundred years. And so this is very important for me to be able to provide this opportunity, not only to discuss the book, but to discuss what their views are, their perceptions are, their analysis of what just happened. And so, first of all, I have to introduce the guest, Finian Cunningham. He's an Irishman. He worked as a newspaper journalist in Ireland, the UK, the Middle East, and Africa. He's written extensively on international relations for Iranian, Chinese, and Russian English language media, including RT and Sputnik. Dan Kovalik. Dan is a lawyer, a human rights activist who currently teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh Law School.
Actually, I have to interrupt. I need to interrupt you there. I did teach there. I lost my position over the Russia-Ukraine issue. They didn't like my position on that, Regis. So
I have to say that Dan is a good personal friend. He's been to Russia several times. My wife and I provided guiding and interpretation assistance to Dan when you visited Crimea a couple of years ago. But I have to mention that he's also the author of several books, including, and I just bought this book today, The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela. He predicted it. And then together with Jeremy Kuzmarov, they wrote Syria, Anatomy of Regime Change. Next is Jeremy Kuzmarov. Jeremy has a PhD in American history from Brandeis University. He's taught at numerous colleges across the United States. He co-hosts a radio show on New York Public Radio and on Progressive Radio News Network called Uncontrolled Opposition. Jeremy is the managing editor of Covert Action magazine, which is known to many of you, and he's the author of 6 books on U.S. foreign policy. KJ No, another personal friend, goes back a number of years, is out in California. He's an award-winning journalist, a political analyst, focusing on geopolitics and political economy of the Asia Pacific. He's originally from South Korea. He writes for Counterpunch, Dissident Voice, Black Agenda Report, Asia Times, Popular Resistance, and others. He is also the co-host of the China Report on the Breakthrough News Network. Ron Ridenour, coming us live tonight from Denmark. He is a seasoned journalist and an author of 10 books who has worked extensively in the United States mass media until he was blacklisted. Another one of us who's been censored and blacklisted for his anti-imperialist and communist views. He worked for several years in Cuba at Fresna Latina. Two of his books that are very important, all of them are, but Backfire, the CIA's biggest burn, and the Russia peace threat, the Pentagon on alert. Gentlemen, it's an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to the show.
Thanks, Regis.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
To start out, I'm going to throw it to Finian. Finian, can you briefly describe the work that all of you have done on your book, Killing Democracy? And then you can take it wherever you want to go, because Dan has just returned from Colombia and he wrote the book, The Plan to Overthrow Venezuela. So I'm not sure exactly where we're going to go tonight, but I do want to delve into the essence of the book, but also commentary on what just happened yesterday. Finian, take it away.
Thanks, Regis, and welcome to all the guys. It's the first time we've been together since the book was published. In fact, I think it's the first time we're ever together while producing the book. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be with my esteemed colleagues. Regis, the book Killing Democracy, it started out as just a drive to survey the criminality of the U.S. empire, U.S. imperialism with its Western vassals, its Western allies, what it calls its Western partners, but they're really just vassals and allies, accomplices. And we wanted to survey the decades of criminality. Now, that's not really that new, because a lot of people, that's been done before by a lot of people like William Blum, people like, Daniel Kovalek has got this book, The Plot to Control the World. It's been done. Ron Ridenour has written about it, Jeremy KJ. We've all written about the criminal conduct of the United States of America. Now, but what we wanted to do was show how the media, the mass media, the corporate media is a very important instrument in this regime change and criminal conduct. And so the book was to survey not only the rampant and relentless criminality of the United States and its accomplices, but to look at how it uses the media, the propaganda system to enable this awful conduct, this criminal conduct. It's outrageous. And I mean, almost kind of like Exhibit A is over the weekend, where the United States attacks Venezuela on trumped up charges, and it's got away with this outrageous assault and violation of the UN Charter, largely because of the American and Western media that has kind of like facilitated this false narrative of the Maduro government being some sort of narco-terrorist regime. And that's facilitated this aggression, this outrageous assault on a nation's sovereignty, and an outrageous violation of international law. So this fits very well into our whole thesis of the book Killing Democracy.
Let's go down to Dan, who's just returned from Colombia and wrote that book about the plan to overthrow Venezuela. Dan, talk about your part in the book. Talk about just returning from Colombia. I guess it's the most urgent news and reports that we're going to have on what's going on there. Dan?
Yeah, well, yes, I just got back from Colombia this morning. On Friday, I spent the whole day at the presidential palace. I actually got 3 hours with the president, Gustavo Petro.
Oh, wow.
Just me and him. And, obviously, everyone in Colombia is very concerned that they may be next. In fact, Donald Trump threatened that. He said, that Petro has to watch his ass. Those were his very words.
Unbelievable.
And so it's very concerning. I mean, as you said, I've written a lot about Venezuela over the years. I've actually met Nicolas Maduro a few times. I'm sure others on this webinar have also. I guess to say a few things about Maduro, because again, as Finian said, a lot of this is, we criticize the media bias and the propaganda. And Nicolas Maduro has been portrayed as this monster of a guy, like, some sort of drug pen, whatever. First of all, people have to know, before he entered politics, he was a bus driver, a union bus driver. This is a real working class guy. He's salt of the earth. He did not seek out the presidency. He became president because President Hugo Chavez died in office. And Chavez picked him to be his successor. But that didn't mean, by the way, he automatically got to be the successor. Under the Venezuelan constitution, if the head of state dies less than halfway through his term, there has to be an immediate election for president. And there was in Venezuela within 30 days after Chavez's death in 2013. So Nicolas Maduro had to run for president. Within 30 days after this very beloved president, Hugo Chavez, had died. I mean, what a terrible, frankly, in many ways, I think that Nicolas Maduro drew the short straw there, right? And I was actually an election observer in 2013 for Maduro's first election. And no one disputes that was a free and fair election. In fact, Maduro won by a very narrow margin, like 1.5%, because he was known, but he wasn't like a Chavez. He wasn't known like Chavez was. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of mourning happening after Chavez's death, and the results came in after midnight, which is actually rare in Colombia, and he won by the narrowest of margins. And again, in a free and fair election, all those things need to be said because he is being vilified in such an unfair manner. I mean, just a couple other, and you can stop me at any time, but a couple things that come to mind in terms of the media narratives. One thing that I, at some point, it dawned on me. So, Infineon, I don't know how much you like this line of analogy, but because we talked about this, but so in 1989, you had the so-called Tiananmen Square massacre in China, right? And there's a lot of, by the way, misrepresentation of what happened with that. Okay, but I'm not going to get a lot into that. But suffice it to say that years after that event, the Western media commemorates that event as a means to vilify China. They again, it's like some almost holiday, when that date comes up. The again, Western media at least claims that hundreds, if not thousands, of people were killed in the Tiananmen Square massacre. Again, I don't think that's true, but even assuming it were true, what the media never tells you about is that in 1989 in Venezuela, you had the Caracazo. You had a massacre in which hundreds, if not thousands, of people were killed because of an uprising against the new president who had promised not to give in to IMF austerity measures. And then when he was elected, he quickly gave in to IMF austerity measures, which raised gasoline prices, which in turn raised food prices. And there were major uprisings in Caracas. That's why it's called the Caracazo. And the state reacted with brutality again, disappearing people, murdering people. Not only is that event never commemorated, most Americans never heard of it before, because that undercuts the narrative that somehow Chavez was an interruption in democracy. No, in fact, he was the blossoming of democracy in Venezuela. And one of the things Chavez did, so the Caracazo did kind of gave birth to the Chavista movement. And in 1998, Chavez would be elected president. And it's important to note that, because you will often hear in the Western press that he came to office through a coup, but he did not. He came to office through an election. And in addition to wanting to have social programs for the poor, which he did put in place, again, what you don't hear is that one of the things he really wanted to do is democratize Venezuela. And he immediately opened up a constituent assembly, and the entire country was able to give inputs into this constitution. There was a referendum to approve the new constitution. It was approved overwhelmingly. And again, a big, centerpiece of the Constitution was to make Venezuela a democracy, a real democracy. And in 2012, Jimmy Carter would say, in fact, that Venezuela had the best election process in the world. And that was under Chavez. But again, these are not things you're going to hear in the press. And this is how, in the words of Chomsky and Herman, consent is manufactured.
I wasn't going to cut you short, Dan. The historical context is so critical. You've just provided that most Americans, including myself, I'm not completely aware of everything that you just outlined historically, but you also emphasize something that's very important that your book is really all about, how the mass media in the United States, and really their, whatever you want to call them, their puppets, their vassals in Europe, have really managed consent. They have really created the thoughts and the beliefs in the minds of Americans, anyway, of what reality is. And that's another problem that maybe we can talk about a little bit later. But I really appreciate the context that you just provided and the facts about not only Chavez, but Maduro. I hope that shows like this and books like you've written and like the others have written will really serve to open the eyes and wake up the American public, because that's really what has to happen. Finian, you want to take over and direct it, or do you want me just to go to each of our guests and then we'll come back to the book?
I'll just say another little thing, Regis, about the structure of the book, or the planning of the book. So we were looking at the post-Second World War period, because after the Second World War, the worst conflagration in human history, with perhaps like 100 million people destroyed. I mean, there was the world was shook, to its core in horror, and the UN Charter was established as a, in theory, to stop any repetition of, the imperialist kind of aggression that preceded the Second World War and led up to the Second World War. So the UN Charter was a watershed point that everybody was supposed to adhere to and abide by. But ever since that charter was established in 1945 in September, I think it was in San Francisco in September 1945, I mean, the United States and its Western allies have been just so incorrigible in their violation of the charter. And it's very important I think, for people to realize just the relentless, massive, continuous violation of a charter, the international, which became the standard of international law. And so the Western imperialist powers couldn't really continue imperialist business as usual. They had to go into stealth mode because it would have been politically very difficult for them to just kick countries around as they had done in the earlier part of the century. But when they embarked on the whole policy of covert regime change and covert destabilizing of a covert aggression of foreign states, the media was a vital part to that whole program. The getting control of the media was a vital part to enable all the other dirty tricks that would be implemented. So this gets back to the point that the media is absolutely paramount in the control of the public's perception to enable criminal conduct. And that's why we make this a very important, like an absolutely massive part of our book. It's the media manipulation goes hand in hand with the imperialist covert aggression. So that's I think what the central part of the book is about. It's how the media is used as a control weapon to just as we're saying with Venezuela right now, that the United States could not get away with such an outrageous attack on a sovereign country, only that the media have enabled like acquiescence or a consent towards this outrageous criminality. And it goes in Europe too. I mean, I was just reading the BBC and various European media, and they sort of like, how would you say, they sanitize what's going on. They've talked about Maduro being captured and being arraigned and brought back to the United States. There's no condemnation in the European media, never mind the American media, there's no explicit disdain for what is outrageous criminality. So the media are absolutely vital to propagating this criminal policy.
Yeah, and that's what the old.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dan.
I just wanted to add. I mean, I forgot to mention this, but just did a very interesting example of media manipulation. I was on the BBC yesterday. I was interviewed by the BBC about Venezuela and Colombia, and they literally cut me off mid-sentence. And I mean, shut it down. Like they shut down the feed to me because they weren't happy with what I was saying. So that's more of an extreme example. Usually they're a little more subtle, but when they have to be, I guess they're a little more, heavy-handed. So I just wanted to note that.
Well, and that's part of the downside. These technology companies are so powerful that they're even shutting down alt media. And those of us that are out there on the blogosphere, they shadow ban, they use algorithms, and then they just permanently delete you from different platforms. So it's really a really tough battle that we're fighting.
With alt media, a lot of that media has been infiltrated. Dan and I, in our study of Syria, found that the alt media presented the same narrative as the mainstream media. It was celebrating the Syrian revolution, the triumph of Al-Qaeda, presenting in a heroic light, spotlighting the human rights abuses ad nauseum of Bashar al-Assad, real and imagined. And they featured people like Shane Bauer, who may be an intelligence agent who attacked Seymour Hersh, and other people like Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal and Vanessa Beeley, who were among the few independent reporters critical of the U.S. intervention. They were attacked as Assad stooges, and they used the word tanky, which was reminiscent of the Cold War, when they would attack people who were allegedly sympathetic to the Soviet Union and defending the Soviet invasion of Hungary, which there's more and more evidence the CIA helped trigger that Hungarian uprising, as Soviet propaganda had actually claimed all along. So a lot of these media, they're very deceptive because they do feature good articles. And if you're a researcher, you would value some of the articles, but they mix that in with these reactionary articles, and I think it's a sign of infiltration. And I think they also try and channel the dissident movements or opposition movements in the United States into certain issues. So they ad nauseum focus on articles on certain topics like Israel, Gaza, while ignoring everything else that's going on in the world. And Venezuela, I mean, there may be some good coverage, but you may also find a lot of anti-Maduro stuff on alternative as much as mainstream.
Jeremy, you made an incredibly important point. Infiltration. The CIA, I personally know about this, has infiltrated a whole variety of peace activist groups, which is part of the reason I think that the peace movement in the United States today is fractured. They've infiltrated large organizations in the United States that have been anti-war, and they've compromised them. And you mentioned many in the alt media. You have to wonder now when you listen to it and you watch it that there's something wrong. That they obviously have been compromised. They have been infiltrated, and that's a terribly disturbing thing. But it's something else that people need to become aware of. Um, I don't want to go on this anymore, but I want to let's throw it over to Ron Ridenour, who spent a lot of years of his life in Cuba and Latin America. Ron, what's your take on what happened yesterday in Venezuela? Did you see it coming? You describe yourself as a communist. You worked in Cuba for all of those years. What's your take?
Well, okay, when we say communist, I want it to be clear to people who hate the word that my kind of communism is not Stalin's, and it is a democratic working class that Marx and Che and Fidel have talked about. So I guess if my icons in the communist world are they're Fidel and Che, and like many other, I think more than a writer. I mean, I became a writer as a weapon. I've always been an activist until the last 3 or 4 years, and one of the ways in which we can be activists on the streets is also to communicate. So one of my important things in life has been to be in places, many countries, to let especially U.S. people and middle class people know what's going on. Many of us in this panel are doing the same thing. I think we ought to have a picture of our book, Killing Democracy. The 5 of us who wrote this wrote about 14 countries that the United States has either regime changed or attempted to regime change, and one of the countries that it didn't succeed in is the chapter that I wrote about, and that's Cuba. So I, of course, want to say something about Cuba, but I was in Venezuela in 2008, and I worked with Chavez's brother, and I wrote a little book about that came out in India for Sounds of Venezuela. But in the early days of Venezuela, there was tremendous, as Dan has talked about. I mean, I saw so much democracy. I was really overwhelmed, and 8 years in Cuba where free press is not possible, and I would have to say that it's a problem. It makes it very difficult for the average Cuban to trust everything that the government tells them. But the reason why there is not free press is very clear, and that is because wherever there is any kind of free press, the CIA is always there, and every media. Charles Bernstein, wasn't it? His from Watergate. Codified that 400 journalists, he had names, were on the payroll, either directly or indirectly, of the CIA. All of the major newspapers. This has also been a part of the church committee. in 75, 76. I mean, it's not just us leftists and communists, and nobody can like communists today that say this. It's been proven, but it doesn't matter. I think the one positive thing about Trump is that unlike every other president until the end of JFK's life, he tells the truth. He's Don Monroe. Monroe Doctrine in 1823. Codified manifest destiny, codified American exceptionalism. They stole half of Mexico. Where is Mexico today? Shouldn't they go in and invade, the White House and take the Trump and the Biden and the Obama, and set them in prisons for they stole half of the country. Well, that's okay. That's okay. I watched this fucking media here. It's for hours that night, and they never in Denmark. Denmark is a lackey, is it's a pet poodle of the United States. Now they're all up in arms in this country because Trump is something different. So for the first time, they've put the United States on a list of potential military threats to their country. It's the only country in NATO and UK that's done this. I mean, in EU that's done this. I mean, they at the same time they do everything they can to please Trump. And for instance, cutting you off, Dan, when they were analyzed, they had an extra half an hour of pre-Trump Rubio press conference the other night, and they had one Venezuelan from Denmark, who's in exile in Denmark, as their major source from Venezuela. Well, this guy, he's Trump number 2. I mean, there was nothing that Venezuela has ever done that was any good. The media did not write about that. The DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Agency, last year said there was almost no, exports of drugs from Venezuela. They didn't even mention that the United Nations has applauded Maduro for doing a lot to get rid of drugs. And when they compile where are most of the drugs coming from, Venezuela is way down on the list. So it's clear that they want the oil. Now they're getting the oil, they say, back from when Chavez made a law that it would be, nationalized and paid the U.S. companies. That's also not talked about. They just talk about it was stolen. Well, if they paid some money, then it wasn't stolen, right? All kinds of countries do this without having to go through regime change. Now I have to get to Cuba since that's my chapter. The day that Kennedy was a big liar too, but he changed somewhat in the last part. Paz Americana, as he said in that famous speech. And yes, he was a capitalist, and he did stop the United States Pentagon and CIA from their Operation Northwoods, which was a false flag plan that would have invaded. They wanted after they lost the Bay of Pigs. They were so pissed off with Kennedy for not doing enough to win the war, and he fired 3 of their chiefs. So they concocted this plan that they would invade their own base in Guantanamo, which they stole from Cuba in 1898 when they came in, and Cuba was about to win their uprising war against Spain. And Teddy Kennedy came in there to so he could be president the next time, and they just stole a bunch of their land. They stole their nickel from Guantanamo. They stole a big area that they call Guantanamo Base, which they still have, torturing people. Now, Kennedy said when the Russian cosmonaut Gagarin flew a mission to talk about cooperation among the world, like the Russia-China and Britain about today, yeah, all the way back in 1961. So Kennedy lied. He said the day that they started to transport troops, mercenaries from Nicaragua and Guatemala, he said, first, I want to say that there will not be, under any conditions, an intervention in Cuba, but it meets its responsibilities to make sure that there are no Americans involved in any action inside Cuba. Well, they have an office, an interest office there, and that's where they have their CIA agents, and they recruit people in Cuba, and give them money, and put them in, and they hire people to sabotage inside Cuba. And they created a huge program in the 70s of bacteriological chemical warfare, which they kill all of their pigs, 500,000, because they infiltrated them with a fever, swine fever. It gets very difficult to go into the historical context with details when we have so many countries. We have 14 countries that we've written about, so I can't go on and on about how much they've done against Cuba. But it's, their general, whom I came to meet a couple of times, in charge of intelligence general in Escalante, documented 680 times that I planned to kill Fidel. Some of this has also been a part of the Church Committee, although they only came up with 6 or 8 examples. But if you could read books by the mafia leader in Chicago, his name is Sam Giancani, and he wrote a book, Double Cross. He has this name that Leslie gave you, people in the CIA, in the Gusanos, of the Cuban exiles in Miami, and mafia troops or mafia gunmen who killed Kennedy that day. These names are often the same names many of them you find in other occasions where the CIA is overthrowing something. Even one of them, Howard Hunt, when he, his last thoughts, in which he named also CIA people who killed Kennedy. Well, where was the work? We had some. Why is it dead? Why all be in the streets in the United States and also in Europe, taking back democracy that we never had in first.
Ron,
right. The last thing that I need to concentrate on is, why is Cuba so important? Besides, I've got to talk about morality. I have to talk about morality.
Ron, if you can.
Most communists don't talk about morality. And before I have to, if you read anything from Che, you always see in it morality. The revolution must not kill prisoners, for example. Fidel says this many times in a great book, Ramon. We never killed, we never punished, we never hurt, we never hit the troops, the Batista troops. If we catch them, we keep them. There's no evidence of torture in Cuba. And Fidel and Che were known for having a high morality. Che told his wife one time when she called in industry at the time, send your car to take our child to the hospital. And she said there, well, everybody else takes a bus, the car is for work. It's not for personal, pleasure or necessity. And I want to just say this one sentence. I have to say it or I will not sleep well. At the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. Our vanguard revolutionaries must idealize this love of the people, the most sacred cause, and make it one and indivisible. To build communism, you must build new men and women, as well as the new economic base. The goal of socialism is the creation of more complete and more developed human beings. Thank you.
Thank you for that heartfelt testimony, Ron. We're going to throw it out now to California and KJ. KJ has specialized in, geopolitical issues, but especially China. KJ, one of the things that nobody really is talking about, and it's that the role that the United States, not the United States, that China and Russia have been playing in Venezuela. Hardly anybody's talking about that, but both are heavily invested there. I'm going to throw it over to you out in California. Pick it up from wherever you want, but I really think it'd be good to kind of make the connection between what we're talking about today, Venezuela, and China.
Yeah, I think the first thing to know is that both Russia and China have been tremendous supporters of Venezuela. And if there's any, more obvious testament to that, just before Maduro was kidnapped, he had met with a large Chinese official delegation. And they had proclaimed, the enduring friendship and support, and almost as if by cue, and almost as if, for the propaganda effect, they went right in and they took and kidnapped Maduro right away. So just that in itself is very interesting. But the thing to understand is that, this rapid decapitation on the surface looks like incredible military planning. That's how they're framing it. It's this, incredible air-sea battle doctrine enactment. But in fact, I think if you look at it more carefully, it's a little bit like a magic trick or an illusion. And you know that oftentimes when a magic trick happens and somebody goes into the audience and does something incredible, the magician goes in and does something incredible. Usually the person that they're working with is a confederate, that they're, a plan that they're working with. And so I think what we have to understand about this is that the fact that there was no resistance, that the resistance seems to have been melted away, that, for example, Russia has given over 5,000 Igla manpads. These are manpads that are capable of shooting down cruise missiles, that are capable of shooting down fighter jets. And they were not able to shoot down a single lumbering, noisy, loud helicopter. Tells you that there was some kind of stand down order involved. China has also provided large amounts of munitions, surface to air, surface to ship, etc. There was weaponry there, and there was a capacity to defend itself. And certainly, Venezuela has jungle and mountains, and the US does not do well in jungle warfare or mountain warfare. So there was the capacity to resist, but it seems like that resistance was completely thwarted or melted away or stood down. And so that lets us know that there was, certainly some level of collusion or corruption that happened. And I think we'll find out more as, the days, as we, as the news comes out. But I think that is an important piece to understand. And because of that, I think, of course, there's in the blogosphere, there's a lot of, misinformed language that says, why didn't China or Russia do something. Well, China is buying 80% of Venezuela's oil exports, the largest investor. It's essentially Venezuela's lifeline, despite the massive sanctions that are designed to make the Venezuelan people scream and to bring down, the Maduro government. It wasn't working, which is why they went in with this deeply, deeply criminal action. I've been watching some of the commentary from different countries. And of course, on the one hand, you have the EU and the US and the British, essentially Keir Starmer said, it's fine with me as long as it scares the Chinese and the Russians. So the flagrant immorality, the flagrant criminality of the Western imperial ruling class is just, abundantly evident for everybody. But I think, the North Korean statement puts it quite well. They say this is another example that confirms again the rogue and brutal nature of the United States. DPRK strongly denounces the U.S. hegemony-seeking action as the most serious form of encroachment on sovereignty and a wanton violation of the UN Charter and international law with respect to sovereignty, non-interference, and territorial integrity. I think that encapsulates it pretty well. But once again, we see the kind of naked violence, the naked brutality of empire, which is always covered up, as many of us have said already, by the media. It's the media which is manufacturing consent and manufacturing amnesia and giving us this completely mystified view of the world. Karl Marx had a good analogy. He said that he was referring to ideology, but you can think of media as a form of ideology. He said it's like a camera obscura, like a black box. And inside that black box, there's a tiny pinhole from where you get information of the outside world. And that tiny pinprick of information projects onto the rear wall, and the image you get is completely upside down. So what we get is an upside down world. And, so this is the work that we have to do to kind of, demystify and bring our critical skills to really understanding what the world is like.
KJ, we don't have time on this show, but I'd really like to do another show with all of you. The role of Russia and China. People are screaming now, why hasn't Russia and China done something? Because they're both so heavily invested in Venezuela. We can't go there now, but it's important that you bring it out, that both Russia and China are major players in what just happened. Donald Trump, knowingly or not, attacked both of them. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Finian, where do you want to go with this? The main thing about this book is to promote it, or the show is to promote the book. And I think, so far we've given a pretty good idea of who each of you are. Your background and expertise is second to none. So the credibility of each of you and what you've written is beyond argumentation. So, Finian, do you want to focus more on the book? Do you want to give each of your co-authors an opportunity to talk about their particular focus in the book and the role that they played? It's up to you.
Yeah, that would be great, Regis, to hear from the other guys on their areas. Just again to reiterate, the objective of the book, the story of the book, is to the West, the United States in particular, and its Western accomplices have just degraded international law and morality so much, just relentlessly, that it's ended up killing any semblance of democracy. And I think when we set out to write this book at the beginning of 2025, I don't think we envisaged just how blatant that degradation would end up at the end of the year, at the beginning of this year. I mean, within months, Trump's well, the United States, not just Trump, the United States policy has just completely blown away any kind of pretense of being, sort of a democratic form. It's just an out and out imperialist rogue regime. I mean, we could call it fascist, but it's a rogue regime, a criminal regime. I was just counting up there, Regis, that over the last year, Trump's administration, his regime, has bombed something like 9 countries. 9 countries. I mean, Obama, the Democrat puppet who was in before him, got some sort of notorious record of bombing 7 countries. Well, Trump succeeded that. I mean, I'll just call them out. Over the last year, not in any particular order, but Iran, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Nigeria, and latest Venezuela. Now, there's 7. We could add in also, with the United States involvement, Qatar, Gaza, Lebanon, and Russia through proxy use of violence. So, you've got a total there of 11 or 12 countries that this regime in Washington has assaulted. And that's just using violence. I mean, there are many other forms of subversion and destabilization that's been going on. So I think, Regis, it's rather shocking and well, how would you say, like, just stunning, just how degraded this regime, this United States regime has become with its Western lackeys. KJ rightly pointed out how the Europeans have completely, how would you say, bent over backwards to apologise for this assault on Venezuela. Keir Starmer saying, "No, I'm not going to condemn it." Likewise, Macron. Likewise, the German Chancellor Merz. I mean, it's amazing. Well, not amazing, but in a good way. It's amazing in a terrible way. Just how egregious this, criminality has become. So the idea of we're living in Western democratic states has just been completely demolished by its own criminal conduct. And that's, I mean, people have to, I think, get their heads around this and realize what kind of power is being implemented here. What sort of power, what sort of structures we're living in? The oligarchy, use of violence, complete contempt for international law, and if we don't wake up to the reality of what we're living in, then it's just going to get worse. We've got to fight back.
We'll talk about that before we conclude, fighting back. But what I'd like to do is throw it to each of your co-authors, our friends, and I'd like to ask them to comment on what you just said about the brazen violation of international law, the UN Charter, all semblance of respect for sovereignty and dignity of other nations. The subtitle of your book was Western Imperialism's Legacy. I wish we could just start saying what it is. It's America. It's the United States of America. And as you kept going back and forth to, it's been the United States that's been behind it, not just for the last 80 years, but really since 1776, the United States has been at war against somebody, all but just maybe 3 or 4 years. I'm not sure exactly what that was. But I'd like to throw it now, go down to Dan, and then we'll go across to Jeremy, KJ, and up to Ron. How would you describe this this empire, and it's the United States? I think we have to be specific. At least that's my opinion. You can tell me I'm wrong, but how would you describe the United States as this? I don't even know how to describe it. Dan, I'm going to throw it to you. How would you describe this empire and what is happening?
Well, I would say it's a criminal enterprise. I mean, as you said, the U.S. actually has been at war throughout its entire history. Jimmy Carter was the one who said, "Oh, we've been at war, our entire history except for a few years," and he was referring to during his term in office. But of course, he conveniently left out the fact that the U.S. really was at war in Afghanistan, for example, during his term in office. Um, so I would say there's been a complete continuity of war, and they've all been imperialist wars. I mean, the U.S. makes no bones about the fact that it wants to dominate and control the whole world. Um, in fact, a good expression of that, in addition to the Monroe Doctrine that's been mentioned, is in 1989. George Bush Sr. as president announced the New World Order, and this was as the East Bloc was falling. And the New World Order was basically that the U.S. would do as it wants, and the rest of the world would have to live with it. And that's the world we live in now. The UN Charter was created after World War II. The big evil it was supposed to prevent was the scourge of war and aggressive war. What does that mean? Wars of choice, which are not, entered into to defend the homeland, right? Countries have a right of self-defense under the UN Charter, but only in case of an armed attack. Did Venezuela ever attack the United States? Did Libya ever attack the United States? Did Syria ever attack the United States? Did Vietnam, even when it was being, uh, you know, uh, blown to smithereens, in which millions of Vietnamese died in the U.S. war in Vietnam? Did they ever attack the United States? You remember all those Vietnamese troops in the streets in New York City? No, it never happened. So the U.S. enters into these wars completely by choice to dominate the world, dominate their resources, and this is completely in violation of the UN Charter, and intentionally so. Intentionally so. With that, I have to run, guys. I have another interview coming up, but thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Dan.
you all. Okay,
Jeremy, pick it up from there. Your thoughts on how to describe this American empire.
Well, I mean, I think a lot has been said already. It fits the model of other world empires. I mean, if you study world history, almost all empires are very rapacious and brutal. You could look at the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire. They all have their justifying ideologies. They cloak it in self-righteous rhetoric. I think the intellectual classes play a very important role, not only the media, but also the intelligentsia. And we have to look at the corruption of higher education in the United States and the failure of public education and history profession. History textbooks completely sanitize the record. They might acknowledge some atrocities, this era of slavery and Native Americans for Native American, but they confine it all to the past, and they don't cover recent events with any justice. And I worked in the historical profession, and it's an incredibly corrupt profession. I think both Dan and I were fired for simply teaching accurate history, and I was very popular at the schools I was teaching among the students who were hungry to actually learn the real history and and try and do better in the present day. But the people who control those schools are corrupt and venal. I think we're seeing a moral breakdown in American society accompanying the empire. A lot of the imperial figures who serve in these overseas wars come back into prominent positions, and they're hardened by their experience. In the war on terror, they're used to torture. We see endemic torture in American police forces. We see, CIA operatives being elected as governors of states like Virginia, Abigail Spanberger. We see complete corruption and disgrace in the U.S. criminal justice system. Where I live, I had a side job covering criminal justice issues in the state of Oklahoma, and there was horrific corruption, and they were firing. I did a story on there was systemic rapes were going on at a woman's prison, and a psychologist who's a very honorable woman reported on the rapes, and they fired her uh, and she couldn't support her kids, and she was treated like garbage when she did the right thing and was beloved by the inmates. So we have venality at all levels of government and society, and some of that is a reflection of, I mean, it's a reflection of the plutocratic elites who have run the country to the ground, and their level of morality is in the absolute sewer. And they're people who lie every day. They lie, they kill. And somebody has to try and hold them to account for their actions.
Wow. KJ.
Yeah, I think I want to give a kind of larger framing, which is that what we are seeing in this current moment is the slow collapse of the US empire. And as empires collapse, they become more and more vicious, more and more naked and violent in their brutality. And concurrent with this, we see the rise of a multipolar world, the global south led by China. Now, to understand something about what's happening, we have to understand that all attempts to resist the empire have been violently suppressed, or at the very least, regime change. That has been a constant throughout the post World War II period. What's interesting also to note is the issue of development. There are only 4 countries or regions or cities that were former colonies that have actually risen to a developed state. They are South Korea, which was the capitalist show pony and was given all kinds of special accommodations so it could have some semblance of development. Although until 1979, North Korea was more developed, richer than South Korea. That's something most people don't understand. The other country is Singapore, which is a city state that's sui generis. And then you had Taiwan province, which was also like South Korea, kind of a capitalist show pony raised inside, a hothouse. And then you have Hong Kong, which is part of China, but again, like Singapore, sui generis, tax haven. And then you can point out a few other island tax havens, and then some semi-sovereign petrostates that have risen from colonial or semi-colonial status to a developed economic status. The only outlier to this is China. China has developed on its own terms, and it has shown several things. First, that you can develop under socialism or under a hybrid socialist system, and that becoming developed does not mean becoming A, more Western, B, more capitalist, and C, now more evidently, does not even entail becoming more carbon intensive, because China is showing that there is a clear path to development without increasing carbon emissions. So that's an extraordinary thing. But with China representing 1/6 of humanity and possibly the largest economy in the planet, and the world's economic powerhouse and the world's manufacturer, that has given a way for the global south to finally arise and resist the US empire. Before that, they were simply picked off one by one, as we see in multiple examples in this book. And so, what we see right now is this huge shift to taking down China and taking down all of its allies. And in particular, Venezuela is a very close ally of China. It was applying to join the BRICS. It was a kind of a center of regional Latin American integration, CELAC, etc., all of these things. And so, what the empire is doing in its desperation is trying to destroy any possibility, any chance of an alternative vision, an alternative system of the world arising. And in order to do that, it's pulling out all the stops, engaging in piracy and kidnapping and overt wars. But also the thing that fundamentally undergirds this, or backstops this, is its control of the media. The Western superpower is, of course, military, financial, economic, all of those things. but it is also its control over the information sphere. That is to say, it controls the backbone of the internet, it controls the algorithms of the internet, it controls the media sphere. And the army literally talks about this. They say that, there are domains of conflict, that is air, land, sea, space, and cyberspace, and information space. So literally, our minds are subject to war. Your mind is a terrain of battle, of conflict, which is one of the things that we're trying to do, is teach people how to reclaim that sovereignty over your own, mental sphere, and then encourage, countries to reclaim sovereignty over their own territory, namely territorial sovereignty, political sovereignty, uh, digital sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and financial sovereignty. If these things can be slowly built up, then we have a chance. And of course, the counterpoint is, or the most dangerous piece of this, is that the US will pull out all the stops. The ruling class would rather see the end of the world than the end of their power and privilege. And so they're willing to do anything that it takes, up to and including nuclear war. And so this is why this work, our work, the work to de escalate the empire gently, to usher it, to let it go gently into that good night, is so important, because the alternative is a global catastrophe. And we don't get a second chance to stop nuclear war.
Thanks for that, KJ. And I hope that all of us can continue discussing the consequences and the implications of what you all have written. KJ, I think you pretty much summarized it. It's, will those, whoever they are, these powerful globalists or whoever is running this empire, become so desperate, realizing they've lost this epic battle for control, will they take the whole world down with them in a nuclear Armageddon? Ron, your thoughts on the empire before we close?
Thank you. That was really brilliant, KJ, and it leads me to add basically one sentence, but I'm very difficult with one sentence. Rubio Escalante, from Cuba, said Rubio was preparing to invade Cuba back 5 years ago. Now Rubio is in power now with Trump, and they're going to invade. They want to invade Cuba, and they want to invade Colombia. Now, we're not going to get out of this unless we do one basic step beyond. Now we're internet. That we have to put socialism on the agenda. We have to stop the bad word. Let's not use communism, but let's use cooperation, getting together, loving one another, being friends, get down to the negotiating table together. And that's not in any way any interest in the major capitalist profits. We have to be able, and I don't know how, to convince people a new stage. Now, China's doing it in their way, and there's some good to that, and I think there's a lot of weakness to that. There was a lot of weakness when they supported the United States in Afghanistan. There was a lot of weakness when they supported the United States in Angola. And it's hard for me to forget that. And I don't know, if they're totally changed. But the question is, really think of the Soviet Union. Well, let's take that from the beginning. Let's have a new beginning. Let's set socialism on the agenda in all the countries where we have some influence.
Thanks, Ron.
Just to
Finian.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
very briefly to Ron. I agree with you. I think the choice is between, as has been said many times before, between socialism and barbarism. And we understand that, what socialism does is it develops humans. It develops human capacity. It develops human society. It develops humans, whereas capitalism exploits humans. So that contrast is clear and obvious. But the key thing we have to understand is that there are multiple alternative experiments in the global south happening around the world in socialism and different attempts at progressive socialist governments. These experiments have to be allowed to exist, and they have all been roughly, more or less, squelched until China came onto the scene. And with its tremendous liberation of the forces of production and its capacity to connect and to, create, a kind of a vision, as well as break the path for other countries to come along. That is optimistic and hopeful for the planet. And I think the duty of the West, in particular the left in the West, is not to criticize the global South for not adhering to their idealized image of socialism, but to prevent the empire from taking down all of these alternative experiments.
Wow. Finian, you had mentioned like what to do and how, and you ended your last chapter in the book, chapter 19. You wanted to end on a somewhat hopeful, positive note. Let's conclude with your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll try to, Regis. I mean, I think we've got to. Sometimes, when people have, disease or some sort of like problem, you have to hit rock bottom before you start to go up. And I think the Western public surely must realize that their governments, their regimes have hit rock bottom. I mean, there is just no saving graces of the Western system. It's kind of like semblance of democracy has just been exposed as out and out thuggery, rogue state banditry, as Trump is showing now, his regime showing towards Venezuela, and the Europeans are all in hock with him. So I think there's got to be some kind of realization through lived experience of people that there has to be some alternative. There has to be a change, and they need it materially themselves to make their lives better. And this is where socialism becomes an option. I think KJ spoke beautifully there, covered a lot of good things, great things, his insights. Capitalism, Regis, in my view, it's an inherently violent system. It's about theft of labor, of your fellow man, about other countries' resources. It is inherently a violent system, and we surely have got the testimony of this violence over the last 250 years, 500 years really, from European colonialism. But certainly with the United States in its 250 years of existence, this year actually is the 250th anniversary of its formation as a state. And as people were saying earlier on, 95% of that time has been spent in violence. So violence is a kind of unavoidable concomitant with Western capitalism. So we've got to. I think the public are beginning to realize this. We're beginning to see this through our own lives, our impoverished lives. Also, just the record out there, the conduct of these regimes against international law. There's no hiding place. There's no disguise for it anymore, as there was in previous times. The media's role of covering up is still effective, no doubt. But the public has got so little trust now in the media. The media has been exposed in itself as being a corrupt institution. And I think hopefully our book, Killing Democracy, is like it's a harsh clarion call, but I think people will, through their own experience and their own perception, will agree with our or conclusion that democracy has been killed, thrashed, and that we have to have an alternative, and let people, organize and form that alternative.
Well, the one thing that you did mention, you left out here in your final comments, was that there's a ray of hope. I agree with you. I think we have to hit rock bottom, and I think we're pretty close to that, not only politically but economically. But you said if we can wake up people, and if people can rise up and become informed and educated, break through the wall of the media and the censorship, I think, and it has to happen worldwide. I believe that it has to be massive, nonviolent, consistent, continuous protest against what's happening to all of us around the world. And I don't know if that can happen. And I don't know how much time we have for that to happen. But I think it's what's motivated each of you to co-author this book, to try to do your part to break through the wall, to inform people. And, the one thing that I've always felt in the last 20 years of my activism, I don't think any one of us is going to kneel at the altar of Satan, is not going to kneel before these powerful forces that are really not just destroying the planet, they're destroying who we are as human beings. And I like the way KJ put it. Socialism has always been about developing humans, human capability, and living together. I want to encourage everybody to buy this book, Killing Democracy. It's available in bookstores. It's available at Amazon. And so I want to encourage everybody to get a copy of it. And I certainly will promote it in the description for this video. I can't thank you enough for this incredible live stream. We've had 14 people who have watched off and on. We've had a number of comments that I didn't throw across the stream, but people really appreciate each of you and what you've contributed. And before I finish, I really would say I think that this format has been extremely dynamic, interesting, and I think credible. And I hope that each of you would join me again in the not too distant future, not only to continue to discuss the book and to keep that in the front of people's minds, but to discuss the consequences of what is just now happening, and should be front and center in front of everybody, because it's not going to go away for a while. So I want to thank you all again. It's been an honor to have you. We'll look forward to doing it again.
Thanks, Regis.
Thank you. To be